Hello, welcome to the first session on the evening of .NET conference. I say hello to Nandeesh that told us about .NET and Azure Identity. Nandeesh, are you here?
Yep, I'm here, Leonardo.
Great. You can share your screen?
Sure.
Okay. We are ready.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we are ready, and you can start when you want.
Perfect. Thank you. Hello, folks. Good afternoon. My name is Nandeesh. I work as a senior program manager in Microsoft Identity. That's a brief intro about me. Today, we're going to talk about modern identity. We will be covering a lot of different things. I understand that we have a short span of time. We have multiple demos to be done. Without further ado, let's get started. This is where you can follow me. You can follow me on Twitter as well as LinkedIn. I'll keep updating about identity and stuff. So yeah, give it a follow. And thanks to all our sponsors for the .NET Conf event. And do check out all our other sessions for .NET Conf. Thank you. Without further ado, let's get started. So here's what the idea is going to be, right? What are we going to do today is I'm going to talk about Microsoft Identity, and then what are those underlying concepts that are really, really important. And we're going to do some, obviously, when I'm talking about Microsoft Identity, we are talking about tokens and all that. We're going to acquire tokens manually to understand the protocols, right? And then we're going to do it automatically using some of our great .NET libraries. We're going to understand authentication flows, what are the different kind of flows and how do we go about it. Then we're going to go into API part, right? We did the authentication and the authorization. We need to now go into calling APIs. That's where we come to Graph API, understand the underlying concepts, what are those permissions and scopes and all those things, and then some more Azure APIs. And finally, we do a demo of connecting to Azure service using MSAL. All right, without further ado, let me get started. Okay, so this is the current state of Microsoft Identity. In fact, I don't even have the data of the current numbers. I think this was probably 3 or 4 months ago, where we had around 200,000 plus Azure AD Premium organizations, 30 billion plus authentication requests happening daily, and around 345 million plus monthly active users. That's monthly, right? Okay, that's great. So Nandeesh keeps talking about identity. What is it, right? As soon as we think about identity, one thing that comes to our mind is our COP ID, right? Yeah, great. That's one of identity. But with Microsoft Identity, with Azure Active Directory, we really changed the scheme of things, right? It became a really global distributed directory, Active Directory per se. It was not just your COP ID. You could save your live IDs, you could save your, external identities per se, like additional domain or something like that. And then you use these identities to connect with multiple other objects, right? Multiple other, verses. Like for instance, you could go to Office, people, identity, or even it could be like devices or, cloud or spaces or anything like that, right? So to put it in one sentence, it became a really global distributed model where, identity was, Azure Active Directory could store all of it and you could interact with almost all these verses. Great, that's great. But okay, what next, right? We get it, that's identity is important and all that. To understand identity, two important aspects is authentication and authorization, right? I'm trying to sort of lay this ground before we get into demos to understand the underlying concepts. Obviously, authentication and authorization are very important. And let me try to sort of put it into definitions, right? What is authentication? In simple terms, layman terms, proving your identity, right? And how do you you use attributes associated to you to prove your identity, right? And what is authorization? Authorization is it is a directives determining what you can or cannot do, right? And it happens only for authenticated entities. For both these scenarios, tokens are very important, right? A trusted source, in this case, Azure Active Directory, Microsoft Identity, generates a token to prove your identity and whatnot. Let me try to illustrate this with a simple scenario. Let's assume, I'm in this building right now, Microsoft Office, and there are different people that are coming in. to let someone in, you need to sort of show your identity. You need to authenticate yourself, right? And then what else? There are different kind of people coming in, right? There's me who's delivering this session from a room. And then there is, let's say, someone working on HVAC systems. And then someone like global security. We have a kitchen where we have our chef and some more entertainment and things like that, right? So I am sitting in this room and delivering this session. If I want to get into the HVAC system, I will not have authorization to do it. Only the person who is responsible to do it may have access to that. And someone like a global security will probably have access to each and every room, right? And likewise for chef or someone from the entertainment industry. So essentially, I'll be able to access only those places which are authorized for me to access. So when we come to the software world, this is exactly similar, right? Uh, that's essentially like what we try to replicate in the app world as well. So a quintessential thing in all of these is application registration. Whenever you have apps, right, and you want your application to be trusted so that you could call different APIs, you need to have that trust relationship. And how does that happen? The first and foremost thing is you need to do your application registration. I will go about showing a simple example as to how you register and things like that before we get into real world demos. But essentially, what you do in registration is you sort of tell what is your application type. Is it a web or a native client or single page application or whatnot, right? You sort of tell what permissions does your app need, because it's going to call into those APIs, and those APIs need those permissions. The redirect URI, where it's going to be redirected post your authentication, and exposing an API where your app itself is sort of exposing an API. It could be a single tenant, multi-tenant, or MSA kind of scenarios, credentials. All of this comes here in application registration. The other important aspect is the gallery apps. What are these, right? I mean, is it just my app that I can register? No. There's so many other applications from our partners like Salesforce, AWS, and so many of them, Zoom, where you can pretty much go to your enterprise app gallery and pretty much install or integrate them and sort of use them as well. Let me quickly show a quick, let me quickly go to an app registration. I mean, how do you go to app registration? You go to your Azure portal, click in app registrations and do a new registration. This is a simple example where you type in like test or something like that, and then you select whether you want it to be a single tenant, meaning it's only going to be in this tenant, or it's going to be multi-tenant, meaning apart from this tenant, which is Nandeesh VS, it's going to run in multi-tenants as well, right? Other tenants as well, or it's a combination of multi-tenant as well as personal Microsoft accounts, or is it just personal Microsoft accounts? And then you have a redirect URI. Let me not register an app because I have already registered a ton of apps for our demos. So let me bring up one. So these are the different blades that I was talking about, right? Authentication is the place where you sort of put this redirect URI. And what is the redirect URI? This is the place where it accepts as a destination when returning from authentication responses, right? This is certificates and secrets where you'll have your credentials. I have a secret created for my demo. And then your token configuration where you can sort of put in your claims and things like that. API permissions. This was the blade I was talking about where you can say, you know what, my app needs this permission. I need to call into that API and things like that. I will be going in little more detail about API permissions in the upcoming slides and demos. So jumping ahead, expose an API is when you sort of want to expose an API, right? And app roles, you can add app roles, owners, roles, and admin, and likewise. So this is app registration in a very brief way. Let me come back to my slides and go ahead. All right, you talked about building and all that, but let's talk about application, right? Let's understand this from an application scenario. What happens in an application? The most generic thing that's going to happen is you need to log in and then you call an API, right? To do that, right, in this case, I'm calling an API if it says that you need an authorization to call me, right? And I don't have it right now. And here is our Azure Active Directory, right? And basically, I need to sort of get an authorization. And how does that happen step by step? First thing, it's going to need something called ID token to identify the user, and an access token is needed to sort of we have different side of permissions. Like I explained, I was showing you the permissions blade. I need to call an API. Here it's called Microsoft Graph User API, where I'm going to read my profile. And to do that, we have a permission called user.read. So what do I need? I need an ID token to identify the user and an access token to read the user's profile with Microsoft Graph as the user, right? So I call an Active Directory, and then what happens as your Active Directory? A private conversation gets set up between a user and identity world. Essentially, this is nothing related to the developer, but a private conversation is created where a secure token, ID token gets generated for the user. With the ID token, what do I do? Okay, you have the ID token. Now, can I call the API? No, you cannot. You just authenticated yourself. You need to authorize. You need authorization. So before I go there, this is the format of your ID token, right? Let me just briefly explain some of these fields. What is ISS? It's the issuer who has issued you the token. This is the issuer who has issued you the token. AOD means audience for this audience, and EXP is expiry, and IAT is issued at, and MBF is never before. These three fields are timeline related fields. And then we have subject for associated with the user. And then we have name, preferred username. Object ID is associated with your app, and TID is your tenant ID. You may not get your tokens in this format. These are JWT formats, and what happens is you need to go to, if you want to decrypt it, you have to go to jwt.io kind of websites and decrypt it. I will, in our demo, show you how it originally looks, and then you can go to jwt.io to sort of get it in this format. That's good. We have our ID token. Now we need to get access token, right? What happens is once you have the ID token, you call into something called a token endpoint, right? That's when you would get your access token. With the access token being there, now can I call the API? This is how your access token looks like. And yeah, now it asks for authorization. And what I do, I have my access token here. So with the access token, I will be able to call the API. How it works, right? I think that's all great. Graphics is all good. Let's try to get get to the core and figure out how do I do it, right? How it works. This is the base URL, right? login.microsoftonline.com. And to sort of signify a particular tenant, we need to append a tenant ID. We can append a tenant ID, or if it's like you want to sort of put it generically, all the organization tenants, you can put it like /organization. If it's a Microsoft account, you can say /consumer, and you don't really know if it is any of it. You can use something called /common. That's great. Now we know this is the base URL. We need to sort of go step by step. What happens? Let's understand, right? There are two endpoints you need to call. First thing that we need is an ID token. To do that, you need to call something called an authorized endpoint. We already talked about the base URL till common. Then we append OAuth2, that is and then v2.2 is the endpoint, and we are calling the authorized endpoint. The authorized endpoint is going to give you your ID token. What are the inputs for it? It's going to take client ID, which is associated with your application. When you do an app registration, let me show you here. When you do an app registration, here is where you will get your application client ID. This is your object ID, and this is your tenant ID. Okay, so that's good. Let's get back to the slide. And then I'm sending scope called user.read because I'm going to read user's profile, right? And it's going to have a response type as ID token. We already talked about it. We're calling this endpoint to get an ID token. So the response type is going to be code. All right, we have the ID token now. What next? We're going to call into something called a token endpoint, right? Now we're going to call to the token endpoint to get an access token. And how you do that? It takes the input parameters again as client ID. The scope is going to be user.read. This is where you're going to put your ID token. You will put in something called client secret, right? I talked about credentials. Here is where you have your client secrets. This is a value, and this is your secret ID. You can create a new client secret. This is needed for your auth. Now, let's go back. What else are the parameters? You have your redirect URI, which we already talked about, and then we have the grant type as authorization code. That's all good. Let's try to do this. Let me try to do a quick demo, right? So I have all these demos set up for you folks today, and let me try to grab the URL. This is the URL that we talked about, right? This is the base URL. Then I have my tenant ID, v2 endpoint, authorize, and then the parameters that we talked about: client ID, the response type, and your scope. Let me do. This is a get call, by the way. This is going to be a get call, HTTP get call. So let me. I can pretty much use a browser to start a new instance, and we can send in this request. Oh, it's asking me to sign in. So let me quickly sign in. It's asking me for my password. Already saved the password. And it's gonna ask me to sort of do a multi-factor thing, which is very, very important. Let me quickly do that as well. It's in my phone. Prove. And that's it. Now, so you might wonder, what is this? It's saying that the page is not reachable or something like that. Because if you remember, the redirect URI we gave was localhost, right? So let's copy this. I don't have any web app hosted on my local host, so that's giving you this. That's fine. We don't really care about this. What we need is the ID token. Some code is appended here. Let's go to Notepad and see what is that. There we go. This is in the JWT format, and that's your ID token. So we have the ID token now. I need an access token. What do I do for it? From our slides, we know that we need to do a HTTP post call now. How do I do a post call? I can use a tool like Postman. Let's try to use Postman and use this ID token to get our access token. So here's a Postman. I've already loaded it up. I've put in the token endpoint, the post call, and then use the form data to set in the parameters. Code is where you're going to put your access token. ID token. Let me put my ID token here, which I've just copied from the browser, and send a request. There you go. It says this is your access token. Let me copy that. Now we have the access token. What do we do next? We need to call an API, right? Let's call an API. This is our access token. What API takes user.read as the permission, right? Essentially, I'm reading user profile, and I know that in graph.microsoft.com, we have an API /me where I can get information about me. I can do some more things where I can get a particular photo or any other attribute I need, right? So I have already set up a get call for calling an API. That's graph.microsoft.com. I'm calling the beta endpoint. We'll talk about graph in the upcoming slides. And it asks for an authorization header, right? Authorization bearer token. So Postman supports this. I've already copied the access token. So let me just go and paste it there. It already shows you a sample. Now, what I expect is if you see I am trying to call me, which is like reading my user profile, in that specifically my photo, right? And then I'm doing this dollar value, which is going to put in my photo. So let me send that request. There you go. Here is my photo. This was around 7 years ago, and I call myself Crooked Nandeesh here. All right. So this is in a way a manual process, right? Where I called one endpoint called authorize endpoint to get my ID token, and then we called another endpoint to get our access token, and then we called the API to get all of this. Well, that's all great, but it just takes a lot of time, right? I mean, all this is manual. That's fairly understandable. Let's automate it, right? We can use authentication libraries. So I have a sample where I'm using authentication libraries where we do the exact same process. Let me bring up the code. Here's our code, right? And straightforward, simple, a console application. I'll show the app registration for this. But what does it take? Let's go through our code quickly, right? By the way, here are the libraries that I've used. I'm using Microsoft Identity client to call into authentication APIs. And one more specific API, which I really love, is the floral.http. I will explain what is floral.http. But essentially, we have client ID here. As I explained, it is your application ID. And then we are building an app type, right? Look at the static class. It's a .NET static class where public client application builder, we're using this to create an app which takes redirect URI. I'm using this like this new feature of like Fluent API and advanced querying, I don't really have to do a lot of things. It's just I can use this advanced querying and then build and get my app. What do I do with this app? We take the scope and the app to do something called acquire token interactive. Well, what is acquire token interactive? If you remember, we had this browser pop up and all that. So we are sort of getting our access token interactively, right? And that is why we call acquire token interactive. We also have an API called acquire token silent, which is essentially not going to be an interactive session. It's going to be like a silent session where a browser pop-up would not come. It would just go in and you would get a acquire token silent, and you pretty much go run with it, right? And what I'm doing here is I'm just printing the access token, as well as I'm calling this graph API that we were calling just a while ago. If you look here, I'm not really doing an HTTP client call or get call or anything like that. I'm just using floral.http, which supports taking access token as one of its parameter with OAuth bearer token, and pretty much calling this API. So let's try to run this and see what happens, right? I mean, before that, let me go to our app registration for this particular scenario. So we have our app registration set up. Pretty simple, no difference, nothing. Only difference being, since I'm going to build a console application, what I've done here is in the authentication tab, you can have selected the platform as a console, mobile and desktop applications, instead of web, which was in the previous case. All good. Let me go run the sample. I've already built this. All right. Let me get into the folder. So now, essentially, what should happen when I run this is we expect authentication to happen interactively, where a browser pop-up should come, and then it should acquire our access token and do all those things and print it up in the same console prompt, right? If you remember, we have already gone to that browser process where we gave permission and all those things. So let's go. OK, let's use this same sign in. It says authentication complete. You can return to the application. Feel free to close this browser tab. All right, voila. So this is my access token, which we got a while ago. And this is the, if you may wonder that, I don't have my photo here. That's true because I'm just dumping the metadata. I'm not really doing a value kind of thing where I'm creating a stream and saving the photo. We will do that in an upcoming sample using some advanced libraries. But yeah, this is to just show you that, all that manual process that we did can be automated and it takes no time. Well, that's all great. This is something that we know. We understand that there are OAuth and OIDC protocols that are happening. What else, right? I mean, let's take it one step ahead. So if you remember, we talked about demoing this. We did this using MSAL libraries. Now let's take it a notch higher. Let's talk about Auth Flows. What are Auth Flows, right? There is a way in which the flow happens from one type of app to the another type of app, and in between where we take these tokens. So there are different kind of flows that happen, and there are different authentication types. We talked about interactive authentication, which we just did, and there are also non-interactive authentication where there won't be a prompt, there won't be a browser prompt, and it happens silently. These are authentication types, right? Auth flows. What are the different types of auth flows? Authorization code flow, device code flow, implicit flow, on behalf of flow, client credentials, and many others, right? These are essentially not the whole list of flows, but some important flows. Again, in this, we're going to talk about 4 flows, and in one particular flow, we will go a little deep. We'll go through the code and run a sample and see that how it works. It's going to be device code flow. All right, that's great. What is authorization code flow? We sort of established there are multiple flows. The first flow we're going to talk about is authorization code flow. Now, what is authorization code flow? Simple, right? You have your web app or you have your application. You pretty much what we did in our app, right? We went ahead, got our access token, and then called into an API. That's an authorization code flow. That's great. Now, what is client credential flow? So only difference between client credential flow is that this happens silently, meaning there's going to be a daemon or a service that's running, and it's going to acquire token using something called confidential client builder, application builder. It's not going to be a normal application builder, and it's going to get your acquired token and then call in the API silently. That's great. What is the third flow that we're talking about? We will have a sample on device code flow, but what is device code flow, right? Let's say you have an IoT device or a mobile device or anything like that, and you're doing something which needs authorization. You do that as step 1. Step 2, it tells you you need to go authenticate yourself and get the authorization code. So you pretty much log in. There's a website that it gives and the code it gives you. You go there and put in that code, and then it sends the token to your device, and then you can call the API and do whatever you were supposed to do in that app. That's great. What's the next one? On behalf of flow. So this flow, we have multiple touch points in which there are authentications happening in each touch point. So your app, and there is an API in your own app. First, you need to get your app, you need to call this API itself, you get all the code that is required. Once you land into your app API, to call the graph or whatever the next level of API is, you do something called acquire token on behalf of user, get that token and then call into the graph APIs. So these are some most widely used flows. Let's try to dig a little deeper into one of the flows, which is say device code flow, right? Let me do a quick demo. Let me go to the sample that I've created. Let's go to our code and see what is it that we are having here. Same, everything is very same. If you remember, we just have the client ID, which is associated with the app registration. And then we have something called public client application builder. And then we are pretty much doing the same things. We're creating an app. The only difference is we are doing this acquire token with device code instead of acquire token interactively, right? And pretty much getting the token. One interesting thing, thanks to some of the latest C# features, I am just doing a quick callback here, right? I'm doing async. Asynchrony is pretty much natural in .NET now. I'm pretty much setting up a callback, although I can do many more things here. Here, I'm just sort of printing my access token into the prompt. If it wasn't for this feature, I should have probably done this call like this, where I had to do an await, and then probably set up one more task to do the same, printing into the prompt. Thanks to this feature, it's pretty much straightforward now. Well, that's great. Now, let me try to go and run and see what happens. Okay. All right, let's do a quick .NET run. So here, the only difference is it's going to say, we are doing this acquire token with device code. It's going to give you this URL, which you will have to use. Assume that this run that we did is happening on your device. Now it tells go to this website and put in this code and ensure that the token gets sent here, and the next step happens. In our case, the next step is essentially to get the access token and print it here. But in a real world scenario, it may be slightly different, right? Let me go here and go to this website. Okay, it's asking me to enter a code. Let me take this code. Right, let's hit next. It's asking me to log in. We'll use the same one that we used last time. Are you trying to sign into device code flow demo app? Yes. I say continue. So it says you have signed in. You make now close this window. Essentially, the authentication has happened now. The token is sent to my device. In this case, we're running it from the prompt. And if you see here, our access token is already printed. That's essentially what we were doing in this code here. So this is, in a brief way, a succinct way of showing you a device code flow. All right, that's great. What do we do next? Right now, authentication and authorization is set up, right? We pretty much did our auth flows. We went through these different kind of auth flows we had. Now what next? Now we need to sort of talk about APIs that we have, right? In this identity world, we have something called Graph, which is, it's just one platform where you have access to all kinds of data. There are different kind of workloads that you can call using just this one platform, right? There are different kind of workloads like Office workload or M365 workload. You have your identity workload, devices, whatever you may want, right? Essentially, it's like a language agnostic gateway to data, right? Graph is that platform. We will do some demos on this. I will show you how it works. But there are different types of data sets that can be called using Graph. These are some examples, and by far, this is nowhere compared to all the API workloads because I could not fit in my slide. Okay, let me do a quick demo. We will first look at something called Graph Explorer, right? This is the best way to learn your graph skills, right? How do you go there is pretty simple. aka.ms/ge. We can go again /ge. And once you go there, it starts the Graph Explorer. There are different kind of workloads here which you can use to run and get details, right? You can see the different workloads like identity and access, insights, Microsoft Teams, pretty advanced. It says list all the Azure AD gallery apps. By the way, I'm not logged in here. I'm just showing it with the sample data. You just run it and it gives you all the data that you need here. And you can do a lot of different things. This supports OData querying. You can do a lot of mix and match with OData querying. Webhooks is supported on Graph platform and many other advanced features that way, right? Well, this is, if you see, this is like a querying thing where we have this URL. And what usually happens is, if you remember, when we did /me, my profile, and then we did photos, we got our data in JSON format, right? Now, if I have to get some specific data here, I need to traverse JSON. I need to write a lot of plumbing code to get to this, to get to data that I need to. Like, let's say in this instance, I want to understand the format of the image, right? So let's try to see how Graph SDK helps you in this case and makes it easy for you to sort of traverse this, right? So what we have, right, is straightforward. Again, we're going to call in the same API that we called the first time, where we got crooked Nandeesh photo, right? We're going to call scopes, the same scope, user.read. Here, we're taking tenant ID, client ID, and then there's a different call that's going to happen here. We have sort of set up interactive browser credential options. This is part of Azure.Identity, right? If you have to look at the different classes that I'm using, the first two is something that we used in our previous samples as well. But in this case, I'm using something called Azure.Identity. And there's one magic that happens here, which is this line of code, where if you remember in our previous case, we had to sort of like run through multiple lines to sort of get our token, right? If you remember, let me go there. We had to do all of this to get our token, right? Right. In this case, it's just this one line where we get a token interactively. There are different classes to get token silently and things like that. Let me go back to the sample. Yeah, it's just this one line of code which is going to get you browser credentials, interactive browser credentials, and you'll get your credential. We'll see that in the demo. In this sample, what I'm doing is pretty much going through the whole authentication experience, and I'm creating a graph client to get something called me variable, where I'm storing the my profile. I'm not really doing any, JSON, Newtonsoft or JSON plumbing code or anything where I have to traverse JSON data. It's pretty much taken care in the Graph SDK. I'm pretty much dumping my whatever we got as a metadata here, and I'm taking it one step ahead where I'm using system.file.io to create a stream and dump the photo into the same folder as the code. So let's see this in action. So let me get to the, by the way, I use Visual Studio Code because I just love it. It's an awesome tool where you can do a lot of different things. I consider it as a proper IDE for me. Let's do a .NET run here and see what happens. Again, this should, I expect the interactive browser credential. We do this whole authentication experience, and then here it should print. If you remember, we had prints for getting the metadata and then printing the type, media content type, and my display name. I am not doing any plumbing here, right? It's just simple object oriented. I'm just printing it. One other thing that we were doing was we were sort of putting in a photo using the file IOStream in the same folder as this code. And there is our profile for photo that is getting created. Here is Cricket Nandeesh again. All right, that's great. Now, what next? This pretty much shows that Graph SDK saves a lot of your time. The whole manual authentication is taken care in MSAL. We have one step higher with Azure Identity where you can use it to use some advanced authentication languages. Now, let's get back to our slide. I understand that we are very close to the time. I have one more demo to show. Uh, let's talk about Graph, right? What is Graph API, right? It has, like I said, it is a gateway to loads of data, M365 data, Azure API data, and more of it, right? There are different kind of APIs. These are the different kind of APIs. Let me go, rather than showing it here, I think it's better we go to an application registration and I show it to you directly in the app. For this demo, I have one app already set up where we're going to call into storage APIs to do some things. Let me go to understand API permissions and all that, you go to this API permissions grid. You can see that we have these two permissions. User.read is something where we were doing this in the last 3 samples, trying to read user profile information. In this case, I'm having one more where I'm trying to have an Azure storage permission. That's all great, but let's try to understand the whole permission, preface, right? These are the different APIs that we have. Microsoft Graph, it clearly explains you here, Office 365, Enterprise Mobility and Security, Windows 10, Azure AD, Excel, Intune, Outlook Exchange, all this in Microsoft Graph, right? And that it has an endpoint called graph.microsoft.com. Likewise, we have for different APIs, like for storage, I think it is storage.azure.com. And for, let's say, Azure Batch, it is batch.co.windows.net. That's what I'm trying to show. And then in any type of API, we have two kinds of permission. One is a delegated permission. As it says, your application needs to access the API as a signed-in user. This is what we did in all our cases. The type that we had, user.read, is a delegated permission because our application needed to access the API as a signed-in user. So that's why it was a delegated permission. What is an application permission? It is used in cases of background service or daemon. When we are going through Auth Flows, I did explain that. So we use application permissions there. That's great. These are the two kinds of permissions. And again, you'll have various other permissions in both these scenarios. Like for Graph, these are the different kinds of application permissions. And for, again, in Graph, these are the different types of delegated permissions. That's great. And then we have something called grant admin consent. I'm covering these basic things. So, we sort of cover almost sort of like an end-to-end preface here. Grant admin consent is essentially, sort of like approve permissions for all users in this Nandeesh VS tenant. Although the nomenclature is admin consent, but essentially what it does is it's going to grant admin consent for all the users in this. Which for what? Admin consent for what? These permissions. And let me get back to my slides. There are some important points there. So we talked about delegated permission, application permission. One more important point is applications specify the range of operation they require by requesting a scope, meaning your application is going to read emails. You're going to ask for mail.read. Application is going to write into emails. Probably you need mail.read write, right? That's the point that we're saying here. And it says application must follow a least privileged approach. What does that mean? Least privileged approach means, let's say your application needs to just send emails. Then don't ask some OneNote permission or don't ask some, advanced permission which is not related to reading mails. Only ask the least privileged permission that is needed. Even if in cases of read write, if your application is not going to write, then I don't think so you need a read write permission. You just need a read permission, right? Essentially, what are permissions, right? Permissions for an app is going to be effective permissions, meaning the intersection of app and delegated permissions. That is the set of operations your app can perform. And then maybe you as a user may have access to do a lot of different things. But if your app where we added those permissions, it is not having, let's say you're an administrator, but your app that you're using does not have mail.read and you're trying to read mails, you'll not be allowed to do it. Vice versa is also true, where your app has permission and you don't really have, you're not even like an authenticate, you're just a user, but you need to do mail.read write, which needs high superlative grant, like admin consent kind of scenario, and you don't have it, so you'll not be able to do it again. So that's one point to note. That's great. Now that we have set this right, I mean, this is an example of different kind of permissions in, like, let's say the user.read. One thing that I want to note here is this talks about admin consent, right? If you see user.read, user.read write, user.read basic.all, these do not need admin consent. However, high privileged apps like user.read.all, where This permission meaning that you can read others' profile. It could be a security kind of scenario, so you need an admin consent. Likewise for user.read write all as well. It is like we're going to write other profile information, so you need admin consent. An important point to note: these were the different endpoints that we talked about. You can create your own endpoint. I mean, I've just put a syntax, but you can use your syntax. I feel graph syntax is the holy grail, and this is how it is, right? Resource.operation.constraint, meaning user is the resource, operation is read, and constraint is all, meaning all. All it's for all users per se. It could be like just user.read, which means just for that user. So this is the syntax of graph API permissions. You can have your own syntaxes, but essentially we ask you to follow this because it is a great way to have a syntax for an API. That's good. Now let's do a quick demo. I know we are on time. I will probably take 2 or 3 more minutes and run through this demo. And let's go. I'm talking about storage and graph SDK. So we have a sample here for storage. Here it is. I'm calling into storage APIs. The libraries that I'm using here is storage.blobs, Azure.identity, which we used in a previous case as well, the graph SDK, and then the normal identity.client. I'm taking in a blob endpoint. This is an additional step where you get it from your storage, Azure storage, and you need to get a blob endpoint, and then you create a client ID. This is again for your application. Same thing, we are doing interactive browser credential, getting in just client ID. Here, if you observe, I'm not sending in scopes. That's not the right practice. You need to send the scopes. In this case, what's going to happen is it's going to follow default scopes, meaning all that is there as added in the application registration, it's going to send that. We don't need that. We need to do like how we did it in previous samples where we say user.read or user.read write or things like that. That's great. Now, what else, right? I mean, we are creating a blob service client, taking in our credentials, token credentials, and then what we are trying to do is we are trying to understand if there is a blob container by name time3 machine. If it is there, great. If it is not there, go ahead and create it. And then I pretty much print all the containers that are there. Let's try to go to our portal quickly and go to my storage accounts. And if you remember, the storage account here was storage demo 1987. Here it is. Let's go to containers and see what are those containers that are already there. So these are the containers that are already there. We have these 4 containers. We don't have something called time3 machine. What I expect to happen when I run this demo is it's going to do our interactive browser credential again and pretty much run through. I expect the time3 machine to get created and print all the container names in the prompt, the console prompt. Let's get to our folder. Let's run. Now it's going to do our interactive browser credential to get our authentication. We're going to use the same ID which we had used for the first time. And there you go. It says that it has created time3 machine. We can verify that from our portal. Let's go here. Let me refresh it. Let's see there. OK, it is created that. All right, that's good. These are my demos and this was my content. Let's quickly take a step back and understand what did we do today, right? Essentially, what we did is that we sort of used MSAL SDK and Microsoft Identity to help you automate through modern identity, right? All these protocols, OAuth and OIDC, we pretty much get it ingrained when you use these two. And what else did we have? We saw a ton of .NET libraries in Microsoft Identity, which help you which saves your time and effort, right? Essentially, we went through all these samples. We showed that you can use MSAL to get the tokens automatically. And then we took a notch higher where we use Azure.identity to help with our C# code where we have advanced classes, and then pretty much got our tokens. The next point I want to make is Graph API. It is a language agnostic platform for all your APIs and data. It could be your own API, or Microsoft 365, or Azure workloads. And the last point is we use Graph SDK, which makes it easy to call Graph APIs and get the required data. If you remember, we didn't do any JSON code, JSON plumbing code. We pretty much used the Graph SDK to get all that data. That's all from me. I would love to hear from you if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have one question.
Sure.
In Azure AD, there is possibility to log all call, HTTP request and the login action, and also log all change in configuration value?
Sorry, I probably didn't get it. Can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
Yes, if you want, you can read it in
chat.
Also in question and answer tab.
Oh, got it.
Yes.
Got it. Perfect. Let me get there.
Yes.
In Azure AD, there's possibility to log all call, HTTP requests and login actions, and also no new questions. It looks like it's. Oops. Is it gone? Okay, it's here.
No, it's gone, but it's
yeah.
Published.
We have a lot of different. We have something called sign-in logs. We have something called. I can show it to you. I think we have a lot of different logs for Azure AD, which you can use to get all that information. If you go here, and I think. Yeah, here it is. Audit logs, sign-in logs, provision logs. You can use all of this to get all that data. Any other questions?
No, no other question.
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot for your time, folks.
Thank you to you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye. See you.
All the best, and looking forward to seeing you again next year. Bye-bye.
Bye.